Now, as we have a quorum of 6 members, including one Chapter Dála, Agus Yanadora 1, we are going to commence the meeting and we are in public session. I want to remind members to turn off their phones, remind everybody to turn off their phones. The mobile phones interfere with the microphone system, and if there's interference, then the proceedings of the committee will not be broadcast. So I'll ask everybody to switch off their phones, please. Have we apologies? We have no apologies. Okay, this meeting has been convened for the purpose of the consideration by this committee of matters relating to the consultation paper on the establishment of an electoral commission in Ireland. The committee will now discuss this matter. Is that agreed? Okay, it's proposed that this part of our meeting shall conclude at around 4:30. There shall be a break for 5 minutes and the committee will resume again at that stage in private session. Now, there is an ECOFIN meeting on here after that, so we're on instructions to be gone from here at 5:45. So is that agreed? I want to welcome the following witnesses to the meeting: Professor Michael Marsh from the Department of Political Science in Trinity College, Professor David Farrell, School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin, Dr Teresa Reedy, Lecturer in the School of Government, University College Cork, Dr Mirish McCorrick, Lecturer in Politics and Public Administration, Queen's University Belfast, and Mr John O'Dowd, Lecturer in the School of Law, University College Dublin. Thank you all for your attendance. I think we're taking Dr Reedy first, are we? Okay, we're going to hear opening statements, and I'm just going to read the section in relation to what you can and can't say and coverage, so on and so forth. It's a bit technical, so bear with me for a few seconds. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that the opening statement and any other documentation that you provide to proceedings may be made available on the committee website after the meeting is concluded. Okay. Yes, we're going to call Dr Reedy first. This is slightly different to my brief. We're going to call Dr Teresa Reedy. What I'm going to do is, the opening statement should be in around 5 minutes. If it's a small bit over, that's fine, but generally around 5 minutes. And I'm going to allow 10 minutes for all members for questions and answers. Now, at 9 minutes, I'll give a warning about 1 minute left, and whoever is in possession, and I hope it's one of the witnesses, in the 10th minute, I'm going to ask him to cease speaking. Okay, so Dr Reedy, you might address the committee.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this public consultation process. I'm here this afternoon speaking on behalf of a group of political scientists, Professor Farrell from UCD, Dr Jane Souter from DCU and Fiona Buckley from University College Cork. And we have submitted a detailed statement, a detailed submission to the process, but there are a couple of points that we want to highlight this afternoon from the submission that we have already made. The first thing that we want to say is that Ireland needs an independent electoral management body. This particular idea, there's widespread agreement on this point. There was an excellent report published in 2008 which provided a really detailed outline on how to establish the Electoral Commission, the structure and role that it would have. The commitment to establish an electoral commission was included in the 2011 programme for government, and the detailed position or detailed agreement on the establishing of the electoral commission was reaffirmed when Joan Burton took over as Taoiseach in 2014. But the initiation of a process of public consultation, which makes clear from the outset that no commission is likely before the next election, really only reinforces the impression that the management of the democratic process in Ireland is not a political or an administrative priority, and one of the main first points we want to get across is that we consider this to be deeply regrettable. The second point we want to make is that Ireland has a particularly long and proud democratic tradition. In fact, we're one of the world's oldest contiguous democracies. We're approaching a point where we'll be celebrating close to 100 years of free and fair elections, and that puts us in a group of a relatively small group of countries, and it's a point that's not often aired. One of the, I suppose, important elements is, that we want to highlight is that data from successive waves of the Irish National Election Study, the European Social Study, have all documented that there's quite a high level of trust in the electoral process in Ireland. In our submission, we go into a lot of detail on the first wave of the electoral audit by the Electoral Integrity Project of electoral procedures in Ireland. It's based on the 2011 election. And the data that we present in the submission affirms the overall high levels of integrity and trust in the electoral process. But the headline figures obscures considerable variation, and in particular the data that we present highlights serious concerns in relation to the electoral registration process, political finance and equality of access to the electoral process for women and minorities. We note that reference is made to the work of Jürgen Elklet and Andy Reynolds in the consultation paper, and we also want to point to a particular piece of work and a contribution that they made in 2005. And specifically, they point out that countries with very high levels of trust and electoral integrity can see that eroded very quickly where there are electoral instances of malpractice. And we would, I suppose, point to recent difficulties with postal voting in the UK and broader difficulties around voting in the United States, all of which have contributed to significantly undermining the overall trust and integrity in democratic systems where there had been quite high levels of trust prior to that. The third point we want to make is that the Electoral Commission should be established immediately. In fact, we think it would be very advisable that even a skeletal body would be put in place before the next general election. We are particularly persuaded by the outline or the structures that were advanced in the 2008 report, which we consider to have been very sensible. We want to, I suppose, point out that it's important that the Electoral Commission be established as a statutory agency. It should be established by legislation and given responsibility for the management of the democratic process. It should have both operational and regulatory powers, and that is important, and that needs to be set out in the legislation. In terms of the overall structure, we believe that it should be led by a Chief Electoral Officer of Ireland. The Electoral Commission then should have an advisory board which should be established by statute, and importantly there should be clear composition criteria in relation to the composition of this particular board. We particularly point to gender balance, but in the submission that we provided we also indicate that there should be communications expertise, electoral expertise, and that these should be required positions as part of the composition of the board. The Electoral Commission should be accountable to the Oireachtas and not directly to any individual government department. Financial accountability should be to the Office of the Controller and Auditor General following standard practice, and we suggest that it should have an annual budget which is negotiated directly in the normal practice, but also a statutory budget whereby it can disburse monies in relation to the conduct of elections and referendums as is required. In terms of the remit of the Commission, or the functions you should have, we believe that the Electoral Commission should be responsible for all areas of the management and administration of the democratic process in Ireland. This should include voter and party registration, boundary division, organisation of elections, voter education, campaign oversight, election and referendum research, and political financing. It should also include the functions currently carried out by the ad hoc referendum commissions. All policy, management and oversight electoral functions should be located within the Electoral Commission. The Commission itself should probably be a relatively small body, and following practice in other jurisdictions, it is probably best that it would continue to liaise with local authorities in terms of the decentralised provision of certain electoral functions, especially in relation to the recruitment of polling day staff and counting tabulation of votes. So to conclude, we believe that Ireland needs an electoral commission, and steps to establish one should be taken immediately.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Reilly. And I'm going to call on Professor Marsh.
Thank you very much. I did send in a presentation slide yesterday. I don't know whether that can be put up at some point.
Can it be done? No, unfortunately not. Sorry?
Except that.
Circulated. It's already circulated.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I might do, you might just highlight the points from it.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Fine. Well, thank you. I've been invited to address a number of questions, almost bewildering number of questions, but they are things clearly that need to be thought through by anybody setting up an electoral commission. Some of these are really outside my areas of competence. The question of costs, probably various works of fiction about how much electoral commissions cost in different countries. It depends what goes in, it depends how it's costed. I don't want to get into that. I'll let an accountant deal with that. Others on which I can add nothing of worth beyond the reports already available, and following Theresa Reilly's comments on the 2008 extremely thorough report, which we thought might have led to something, but unfortunately, or fortunately for some people, there was an election instead. So I'd like to address the question here of the functions that an electoral commission might fulfil. I can imagine that some people would say, why do we need an electoral commission? Sure, everything's grand out there. Electoral integrity is quite high in Ireland. Not a lot of complaints by the majority, at least about the process. The outcome is another matter. Now, I also note the briefing document prepared by the Oireachtas Library and Research Services reference a brief submission I made to the Constitutional Convention on this topic. Why do we need an electoral commission? So what I have to say, I just want to expand fairly briefly on that submission. First of all, I can say that most of the countries I think we might compare ourselves to have an electoral commission. And I mentioned in particular Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and even the UK, which doesn't tend to be ahead of the game on these sorts of things. The widespread use of this option, I think, reflects a norm that sees more legislation covering elections and the removal of electoral matters from direct political control. We've seen this in Ireland in the last few decades, with the creation of ad hoc institutions to determine boundaries. The minister used to do that. Then SEPO, looking after finance, and successive referendum commissions. So we've moved in that direction, but we've moved by setting up a number of ad hoc bodies to deal with these things, very often with many of the same people. Table 1 in my submission just compares functions across 4 countries, Australia, UK, New Zealand and Canada, various functions that electoral commissions fulfil. Managing the electoral register, that's done by all the commissions apart from the UK, where it's done locally. Conducting public elections and referendums, again by all but the UK. Administering the rules, including funding, registration, those sorts of things. All the electoral commissions do that. Determining boundaries. All the electoral commissions have some role in that, even if it's incidental, usually by an overlap of personnel and by providing the servicing function. Educating the public. They all do that. Educating, advising, informing government and parliament. They all do that. And we might think about the Irish case and those same functions. Managing the electoral register is done essentially by local government. Conducting public elections and referendums, well, the Referendum Commission does a little bit of that. The department and local government does a bit of that. Administering the rules, I think that's what SEPO does. Determining electoral boundaries, we have ad hoc electoral commissions. Educating the public, not sure who does that. Educating government and parliament, probably the department. Probably. Only in the UK are the first two functions not the preserve of electoral commissions. The rest are fulfilled by electoral commissions everywhere. Now, if we look more closely at these research and educational functions to get a better idea of what they are, in New Zealand, the Electoral Commission's role includes advising the government on changes to electoral rules, reviewing electoral law and procedures, advising those involved in the conduct of elections and referendums. The functions of the Canadian Electoral Commission include reporting to Parliament on the administration of elections and referendums, carrying out studies on alternative voting methods, and with the approval of parliamentarians, testing alternative voting processes for future use during electoral events. Now, why should we give these functions to an agency dedicated to this relatively narrow range of functions as compared with leaving it with ad hoc bodies and the Department of the Environment? The first are they run less risk of being ignored or given a relatively low priority. And I think many of these things have been given a very low priority in the past. And second, and this is most important perhaps for the research and new ideas function, apart from the fact that more research and more new ideas might become available, these ideas come from a source that would be seen as non-partisan. Can't be discounted immediately because it has the minister's fingerprints all over it. The right of citizens to vote is a central element in democracy. The electoral register, a list of who is allowed to vote and who is not, is clearly very important in that. It's widely recognised that the electoral register that we have from our decentralised procedure is far from accurate. It includes many who have no right to vote and does not include many who do have that right. And this has been talked about for really quite a long time now, and it's probably no better. Different local authorities have gone about maintaining it in different ways with very different degrees of zeal and enthusiasm. They have to spend their money on it, and I'm sure they can find, as they see it, better things to spend their money on. As regards new ideas on electoral matters, these have in the past largely come from governments. Suggestions for changing the electoral system to a more majoritarian one was a brilliant idea in the 1960s. It was seen as partisan and rejected by the people in referendums. There have been relatively few other innovations. We did see the addition of party labels on the ballot. Most people would probably see that as a good thing. And later, photographs added to ballot papers. Recently, we saw a somewhat ill-fated experiment with voting machines. These ideas came from the Department of the Environment. When it comes to referendums, the practice is now to establish a referendum commission each time. The precise functions of this body have changed a little over time, but it's always been there to maximise citizen awareness, to help them to engage in the process properly. Anybody reading through the reports of each referendum commission, something it's been my professional duty to do, and maybe all of you haven't read these things assiduously, would often think it was the same report, because they always say the same thing, except maybe the one set up on Lisbon 2 that was so important we actually set up the commission a very long time in advance. And what the referendum commission always says is, why didn't you set us up earlier? We could have done a much better job if you'd set us up earlier. Now, even allowing for the fact that governments procrastinate in setting the vote, permanence would greatly facilitate the work of the commission.
I'm going to interrupt you there because we're over nearly 9 minutes.
Okay.
But your presentation has been circulated and you're coming back for Q&A in any event.
That's
okay?
fine.
I'm now going to call on Dr. Murish McCorrick.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much to the committee for inviting me here today. It's a privilege to be here. I would congratulate the committee on taking time to think about this issue. I'm not at all an expert on electoral commissions. A lot of my work is very much on public organisations, and I suppose most of the members might be aware of the review by the OECD of the Irish Public Service in 2008, when they said what they found was this organisational zoo. And really, to use that analogy, I suppose my contribution, I'd just like to assist the committee in thinking about, well, what is the consequence of introducing a new animal, as it were, to the zoo? If we were to think, I mean, it sounds like a very good idea. There seems to be a lot of support for the idea of an electoral commission. But it's worth reflecting, as you are doing, about, well, what exactly is this going to look like? How is it going to operate after day one? And really, maybe that's where my contributions would be focused. The paper I've sent around, I'll just summarise it very briefly. It's in a bullet point format. I mean, the general idea here is that we have a very long history in Ireland, just as we have a long, proud democratic tradition. We have a very long, proud tradition of creating bodies in response to policy problems, usually in response to a new issue, not so much taking issues away from government departments and so on. Relatively rarely to consolidate functions, as seems to be the case for this electoral commission. And again, you just have to be a bit careful when you're taking bits from around the system and putting them together into a new body. That's fine, and that's very plausible, and it sounds very logical, as I'm saying. But just to think about how are all of these functions going to be managed and coordinated, that there aren't gaps, there aren't overlap, and so on. These are common questions in the organisation of government. In terms of titles, everyone's talking about an electoral commission. Really, names, unlike in other countries, names don't mean so much in Ireland. We talk about commissions, councils, authorities, boards, agencies. It doesn't have any legal standing. They don't confer different rights, different powers, and so on. Agencies in Ireland are defined organisations by variety of governance arrangements. And again, the paper, which I haven't read, I have to confess, by Teresa and David and others, I mean, sets out, again, a very plausible governance structure at the higher level, which I'll come back to in a second. I would also say that, agencies now, in the context of the financial crisis, new agencies in Ireland are being created in a very different environment. It's a much more regulated environment. So, budgets aren't necessarily on annual bases anymore. They're over 3-year envelopes and so on. They are subject. They are to be subject to critical review every 3 years and so on, which is quite possibly a good thing in the case of a new organisation. In terms of boards and so on, again, in Ireland, we see this internationally as well, a move away from stakeholder, like let's have people from affected groups on boards, a move away to the much more professional, and again, as Dr. Reedy has mentioned, about people who bring certain skills to the party, as it were, certain competencies. And again, I would just urge the committee to think very carefully about who it's appoint, what exactly the people on an advisory board or a commission. And again, the consultation paper written in 2008 was very good. But it didn't go the next step in terms of if you're to have a judge and the CNAG and the clerk of the Dáil and the clerk of the Seanad. I'm not sure if they had the chance to think through, would any accountability dilemmas arise here? Like, could the CNAG be suddenly auditing himself, as it were, if you know what I mean? Or could a judge, say there's a crisis and you've decided that a judge is to head this electoral commission, and suddenly there's some sort of constitutional crisis and you have a judge involved. I mean, I can't think of a specific example. Again, it's just having a little bit of reflection about who is it most appropriate to have on the board of such an entity, if indeed you are to have a small board. And as I say, the trend in Ireland has been, when I looked at this in 2010, I counted something like 2,300 kind of board governing authority memberships in Ireland in total, and so the average is about 12, but it's getting smaller, and international best practice is to have small numbers. There's no best organisational form. You'll have picked up that from what I'm saying. If anything, internationally we see more and more diversity. Sure, what Professor Marsh has pointed out as well, that there's diversity amongst electoral commissions, just as there is for other types of public organisation. We tend to look to other countries to see can we copy, but really we need an Irish electoral commission, which is unique, specific to the Irish situation. Think again about accountability. If it is to be accountable directly to Parliament in the way the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency is, the Ombudsman is, and so on, that's fine. But accountability is not just upwards; it's also downwards to the public, and thinking away about how citizens, how such a commission is accountable to the public in what it does, and how it can in practice demonstrate that. I mean, it's not just about an annual report. It might be about adverts and so on television. There are I'm just skipping through the points here. Yeah, there's also something of a paradox to be aware of as well, that the attempts to depoliticise issues, and again, it's not really been an issue in Ireland where integrity is quite high, but it is always something to be cautious of, that the attempt to depoliticise any issue by putting it over there in an arm's length body, I'll refer you to the poor unfortunate HSE, often can have the perverse effect of becoming a real focus for political anger when things go wrong, or a focus of political criticism. And again, making sure that the creation of this entity is robust enough to stand up to any form of political interference well into the future, whilst at the same time being responsible to genuine and fair political criticism for its actions is very important. Yeah, I've mentioned these other points here. I have just about that agencies being created nowadays can't be divorced from changes that have taken place in the wider Irish public administration, about they'll be subject to much higher levels of scrutiny, financial accountability and audit than existed hitherto for a lot of bodies. And I would, yeah, I asked some colleagues in other countries other than New Zealand, Canada, the UK and Australia. I thought it might be of use to the committee. Said, look, has anything come up in your countries in respect of electoral commissions? And I'll just give this to members here. In the Netherlands, there's been a big change recently in their electoral commission, that they've changed the legal status of the employees of the commission. They thought it was a good idea that the people working in the commission would have a separate legal status, that they wouldn't be civil servants in the normal way, as in other government departments, in case there'd be any undue pressures or anything like that. So they have a separate legal status. Reviews, this is an interesting one. In Sweden, they've created so you have the Electoral Commission, but you have a subsequent body which decisions of the Commission can be appealed to. So again, I'm not sure if that's been considered at all, but what if there is some sort of a crisis? Who decides? Is it the Parliament, or do you need another body? And yeah, again, and that's chaired by a judge. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. McCormick. And now Mr. John O'Dowd.
Thank you, Chair, for the invitation. I'd like first of all to say the consultation paper produced by the Department is an excellent starting point for this whole exercise, I think. And as Dr. McCarthy just referred to, it takes much further than we did in our study in 2008, the examination of some of the governance arrangements, in particular in relation to an electoral commission. And it's very gratifying to hear the nice things people said about the 2008 study as well. I think when we entitled it a preliminary study into the establishment of an electoral commission, we didn't realise quite how preliminary it was going to turn out to be. But it may be useful after 7 years to look back at some of the issues that have been raised in the consultation and to give my own thoughts on them as they have been formed to this point. So in compiling the 2008 study, it was very striking that there were different levels of satisfaction with the operation of the administration of elections here, as previous experts have referred to. So at one end of the spectrum, in talking to the political parties, in talking to the department, in talking to the returning officers themselves, there was a very high level of satisfaction with the way, now there were the occasional complaints about particular issues, but there was generally a very high level of satisfaction with the way in which the core function of conducting elections is conducted. Such as the nomination of candidates, the production of ballot papers, polling, and the counting of votes. And it was recognised that it was appropriate to do this both at local level and also to involve people such as the returning officers who are independent of the public sector to a large extent and are just brought in for this particular function periodically. More towards the middle of this spectrum of satisfaction, there was a fair level of support for the Standards in Public Office Commission in terms of its performance, but there were specific inadequacies in the legislation identified, some of which have been remedied since, and there was also, I think, a complaint or there was praise for the Commission in the sense that it did a very effective job with very slender resources, and it certainly in terms of enforcement, for example, it could have done with a much better level of resourcing. So the main area of dissatisfaction has already been mentioned several times, and I'm sure, as you're all well aware of as public representatives, was in relation to the maintenance of the electoral register. And we recorded this, and several other reports noted it. And many of these concerns, as has already been mentioned, relate to a lack of consistency and cooperation between local authorities, and in particular the very different level of performance that different local authorities were able to achieve. And just as an example, it's not the total explanation, but one example that was given to us was that in many local authorities this function seemed to have a very low prestige attached to it, so that if anybody did particularly well in the franchise section of a local authority, they rapidly got promoted to some more important post, and somebody else had to start all over again learning on the job.
So it was also striking in our report as well, although it's difficult to document this, but from talking to people, it was striking that the actual role in the system of the franchise section of the Department of the Environment went considerably beyond the formal description of its responsibilities. So it was essentially the brain of this quite decentralised electoral system, and through various informal levers or channels of communication, it carried on much more of a coordinating role than was formally described in the legislation or the published practice. In the consultation paper, it's noted that we, in our study in 2008, favoured a phased and partial consolidation of function in relation to elections into a new commission, and I don't see any reason to depart from that. Given the differing demands and expectations in relation to the various electoral functions, it still seems reasonable to me to concentrate on those functions that can be quickly and easily consolidated into a new body of this type, rather than attempting to set up a new institution and to make radical changes to the administration of elections simultaneously. And I'm personally still of the view that the Standards and Public Office Commission ought to remain the core of the new body, and that in the short term it should have oversight rather than direct responsibility in relation to electoral registration. So there is some scope, I think, for improving the performance of local authorities in this respect through establishing performance norms and supervisory mechanisms, while a more fundamental reform of electoral registration is planned and prepared for. It's noted in a number of places that PPS numbers might play a role in a new system of individual rolling registration rather than household annual registration. As we noted in the study in 2008, of course, it's somewhat misleading to focus just on PPS numbers, because experience in Northern Ireland and elsewhere shows that a very wide range of identifiers has to be used in order to satisfactorily establish the identity and the entitlement to vote of a particular individual. And similarly, in relation to the actual administration of elections, the type of conduct that returning officers engage in, we noted in 2008 that there's probably a need only for a very general oversight function in the Electoral Commission rather than a detailed assumption of that role. In relation to the composition of the Commission, I'm open-minded about whether the study we authored in 2008 made the right call, that the new Commission ought to be constituted in broadly the same way as the Standards and Public Office Commission and similar bodies, and that it should specifically exclude people from it who had experience in party politics. Dr. McCarthy has referred to the fact that there's a very reasonable case to be made for a smaller, specially appointed board to exercise oversight over the operations of an electoral commission, or to be the electoral commission. And there are cogent reasons for this, as I say, on grounds of effectiveness and accountability, but I remain to be persuaded that it's going to be possible in the short term to come up with a method of appointment that retains the undoubted impartiality and legitimacy that are clearly desirable here, particularly bearing in mind that the new body will have responsibility not merely for the conduct of elections but also for referenda. And I make that point because it might be possible to get agreement amongst the political parties as to who suitable people are to serve on an electoral commission, but if the electoral commission is to take over the role the referendum commission has in relation to referenda, given that in many referenda the political parties don't represent one side, the no side, in a referendum, it could be that a body that's satisfactory to the political parties is not seen by those who are proposing a no vote as a referendum as being a legitimate entity. Where I would perhaps differ in emphasis from the consultation paper is in relation to the planning and policy functions of the new Electoral Commission. The consultation paper on page 42 observes that the circumstances have largely changed since 2007 and 2009 in relation to whether an Electoral Commission should have a significant advisory role on electoral and political reform issues because of the enactment of a considerable number of significant pieces of legislation, and the Department's entitled to take some credit for the fact that there have been substantial changes in party funding and other aspects of electoral law. But I wouldn't be as sanguine as the Department is in the consultation paper, or appears to be, about the fact that this is a closed chapter, because there's a need for the electoral system to be kept under constant review and for forward planning so as to take a proactive rather than reactive approach in relation to electoral policy and administration. And it seems to me to be desirable that an electoral commission should have a significant role in relation to these matters, and that the franchise section of the department shouldn't be left as the dominant governmental actor in terms of planning and policy change in relation to elections. As I've already noted, the franchise section has a role in relation to elections and the development of policies and standards in relation to them that goes somewhat beyond the formal specifications of its responsibilities. For example, it's clear there is a degree of long-term planning at work in relation to the work of successive constituency commissions, and it seems plausible that this element of continuity is influenced by the support role which the franchise section has in relation to it. The franchise section is generally, although not always, discharged as coordinating and planning roles well in relation to the electoral system, but within the constraints of a departmental administration, where particular ministers have particular projects they want to, be associated with and take credit for, and don't necessarily always go smoothly. So it strikes me that a meaningful electoral commission must to some extent supplant some of the functions that are now performed within the department and would ideally involve appropriate transfers of staff to the new body. And perhaps in that context, it's not surprising that the consultation paper to some extent skirts around this aspect of the planning and transition for the new body. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Dowd, for that. I'm now going to go to members, and I'm just going to repeat, because some have arrived since we started. Everyone's going to get 10 minutes for questions and answers. When there's a minute left, I'm going to indicate to our witnesses there is a minute left. Whoever is in possession ceases speaking. I'm going to begin with the opposition, government, and do it that way. And the opposition is Deputy Barry Cohen. You have 10 minutes, Deputy, for questions and answers.
Thank you, Chairman. And can I thank all the contributors for their expertise and their submissions that they've made in light of the request for consultation process in relation to this issue. I've no questions per se, to be quite honest. I acknowledge and appreciate everything that has been said and agree with much of it, especially the first contributor who talked about the lack of leadership on the part of government to put forward a draft commission, at least, in order for a consultation process to emanate from that, whereby we might be in a position to have an independent commission in place for the next election that has been mentioned. The amalgamation of the department's role itself with the local authorities, with SIPO, I think that in itself could have formed the basis for an electoral commission that could have done the work that was contained within the, I think there was all-party agreement in relation to the report that emanated in 2008. It's a commitment on the part of this government in 2011 and the programme for government to do so. Again, as has been referred to by Minister Burton when she finished her discussions with the Taoiseach. And after each election that we've had, especially referendums during the lifetime of this government, there's been a commitment made by members of the government to bring forward an electoral commission prior to the next election. But unfortunately, like much of what was promised in the form of radical overhaul of the electoral system, of the way in which politics is done and how it's led, we've seen nothing, only balls of smoke, to be quite honest. And while I welcome the contributions that have been made, I don't think the sort of leadership that was promised is being given by government in this area, and I think we'll all be the worse off for it in the context of the next general election. And I would hope that the message that might emanate loud and clear from this gathering here today, if nothing else, to ask the government to take the bold step and make proposals that can then be adjudicated and we can reach agreement in order for us to move forward.
Thank you, Deputy Cohen. Just before we go any further, can I just ask a particular question, and two of our witnesses referred to it. In relation to the international models, that they be Australia, Canada, and I direct this to Dr. Reedy actually, who in your opinion, Dr. Reedy, of which system, let it be Canadian, Australian or the UK, is the one that we should aspire to here, or the one that's more apt to our particular, I suppose, our electoral system and the nature of politics in this country?
Elections Canada is acknowledged internationally as one of the most robust election management bodies. It's a very large agency, and it's evolved since about 1920, so it's something that has developed over quite a long period of time. It has quite extensive roles and robust powers, and in terms of scope and function, I think Elections Canada would be where we should aim if we're really looking for the best model. I think, though, it's also worth noting that just in terms of model that's similar to Ireland, New Zealand is also a small, relatively homogeneous country. So certain elements, and particularly in terms of the scale, we should look also to New Zealand. So scale for New Zealand, but in terms of scope and robustness, Elections Canada.
Very interesting. Professor Farrell, do you want to say something to that?
No, I completely agree.
Okay, that's a very, very interesting point. Now on Government Deputy James Bannon.
Thanks very much, and indeed I'd like to work on the personnel here before us this morning, and I mean this is something that has been discussed for quite a long time. It was very much to the fore when we introduced the e-voting machines, which was a dreadful fiasco, indeed cost this country something in the region of 60 million plus of taxpayers' money, and I mean it is something that still
The country's finest brains in front of us, and eminent political scientists make use of it, please, Deputy Bannon.
But anyway, Dr. McCarthy there spoke about he didn't feel there was a great need for setting up of a commission, if I got him right. I mean, we need to fix a system that is not working. And I mean, as a practicing politician, I recognise the fact that there's huge problems with the electoral register up and down the country. For instance, I mean, after each election we're told about the numerous errors that occur, and in every single register throughout the country there are errors, and there are serious errors where you come across people who have been on the electoral register for something in the region of maybe 40, 50, 60 years, and turn up a polling booth and embarrassingly find that they're no longer on the register. And this is because the system of compiling the register is not a rolling system. You start from scratch every single year within the local authority about September, October, and you haven't the resources, and it's within the local authority to upgrade and improve and supply an accurate register of election. The resources aren't within the local authority, and I feel very strong the need for a single independent body to compile the register in particular. And I think that you need it centralised too. An electoral commission would be something that would be centralised, and I believe there would be a greater degree of accuracy with an electoral register than with the current system. I mean, local authorities, I'm not criticising local authorities, because local authorities has done the best possible job in